As people, we all go through life stages or through events where we have to leave stuff behind. Sometimes it's difficult things, and sometimes it's for our good. So, for example, when we move from childhood to adolescence, we leave behind some of our innocence, but we also leave behind that dependence on other people for everything. Or when we leave home for the first time, we leave behind some of the stability, the safety of the family home. But for some of us, we might be leaving behind some difficult relationships, some dysfunction that's made it hard for us to live in that place. Or again, when we move house or start a new job, we're leaving behind familiarity, friends, memories, but we're also leaving behind a space or a role where we haven't been able to grow as much as we want to. It's part of the human experience. Leaving things behind us is what we do. Hey, and what about 2020? This year has been full of stuff we've had to leave behind as well. Some of it's been good stuff. So for me, I left behind at the beginning of lockdown a life that was really stressful and frenetic, filled with too many things and not enough time for anyone. But for some of us, we've had to leave behind some really important moments, some special events, celebrating the end of school or a wedding or a dream holiday. Some of us have had to leave behind jobs, and some have had to say goodbye to people without having a fitting way to do so. Leaving things behind is average for human existence. Well, I believe that Jesus has a lot to say into this. Jesus had the experience of leaving things behind as well. And today and over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at the story of Lazarus from John's Gospel and having a look to see in it what we can learn about leaving things behind before we emerge into something new. So, just for a little bit of context, Jesus has been travelling around over the last 2 or 3 years of his ministry. He's been teaching people, he's been healing, he's been declaring God's love and showing people what the kingdom of God looks like. He's been teaching people what it is to love God and to love one another. He's got into this sort of familiar pattern or rhythm, if you like. And he gets news that his friend Lazarus has fallen ill. Not just fallen ill, but he's at death's door. Now, Jesus could go straight there. He could hurry and circumvent the difficulty, bypass the situation and heal Lazarus directly. Because we're told in verse 5 that Jesus loved Lazarus and Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary. But we're also told that because he loved them, he delayed. He didn't go straight to Lazarus. Why? Why did he wait? Well, I think there are a bunch of reasons, and some of those show Jesus's humanity, and some of them show his divinity, and they're all sort of interlaced. The first one of those things, I believe, is fear. See, Lazarus lived in Bethany. It was a small town just outside Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And Jesus knew that if he returned to Bethany, that if he got closer to Jerusalem, he would be facing his opposition. He'd come face to face with that hostility that he'd been trying to avoid over the previous few weeks and months. He knew that if he returned to Bethany, it would be a turning point for him. It would be that moment when he had to change direction, when he would have to leave behind the familiarity of teaching and healing, the familiarity of friendships, and turn instead towards Jerusalem, the Passover, and what he had to do next. At the same time, though, in the midst of this fear, Jesus has this divine desire to demonstrate God's glory. So he's living in this kind of tension, the human fear and the divine necessity to demonstrate God's glory in the midst of this situation. And Jesus overcomes his fear. He acknowledges it, he knows it's there, but he doesn't stay with it. He moves on, he leaves behind that fear to go on to what he knows is next. So that's fear. I think Jesus also demonstrates his human capacity to grieve in this story as well. So he arrives at Bethany, and Jesus finds that Lazarus is already dead, and he finds that Martha and Mary are grieving. They're full of deep sadness at the loss of their brother. And Jesus doesn't ignore that sadness. He doesn't tell them to get a grip. He identifies with it. We're told in verse 33, when Jesus saw them weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. See, Jesus identifies with his friend's grief. He arrives at the grave of his friend Lazarus and he weeps. He demonstrates solidarity in their suffering. But again, in the midst of this human grief and suffering, the divine shows itself again. Because Jesus doesn't go around the suffering, he goes through the suffering in order to show this miracle. There's something about sitting in the grief and suffering which enables God to demonstrate God's power. Jesus works through their suffering and sadness. He doesn't work around it, he doesn't work over it, he goes right into it and then out the other side. He doesn't bypass suffering, he identifies with it. And only then does he move on to the next part of the story. Because before we can move on, before we can emerge into something new, before we can find out what our new normal is going to look like for the next few months or even years, we need to acknowledge what we've had to leave behind. We need to sit a little bit with the disappointment, with the things that have been difficult to leave behind us. We need to acknowledge the loss and the sadness for some of those things. Because it's only in doing that, in identifying with them, just as Jesus did, that we can move on in a healthy way. We need to sit with the sadness. We need to weep over what we've left behind, just as Jesus did. Because Jesus didn't hurry, and we don't need to either. So what are you afraid of? Are you afraid, like me, of things going back to how they were before, frenetic and stressful? Or maybe you're afraid that this restricted lifestyle is going to go on way too long, much longer than you think you can handle. Or maybe you're afraid of the unknowns, of what it's going to be like going back to school, of your job, your health, your family members, your relationships. And then what do you need to lament? What do you want to acknowledge that you've had to leave behind these last 6 months? What have you lost? Is it a business or job? Is it a significant family member or friend? Is it a fitting goodbye to someone who's passed away? Or maybe it's simply 6 months of living a normal life with healthy relationships and normal day-to-day routines. Whatever it is you're afraid of, whatever it is you've lost, it's okay to acknowledge those. The story of Jesus and his friend Lazarus's death teaches us that it's okay to fear, that it's okay to acknowledge what we leave behind us, There will be a time for us to emerge into something new, but let's not hurry there. Let's, just as Jesus did, let's delay the miracle. Let's sit with the disappointment. Let's acknowledge the fear. And in doing so, maybe we'll open up space for God to divinely intervene in the midst of our own suffering. Let's not hurry, but let's wait on Jesus, God, the man, the one who knows what it is to fear, to grieve, to leave things behind, and to suffer loss.